The talking points of the new week now, Joe Coburn and Politics Live.
Which political party is the party of business? Raab's resignation, bullying or the blob? And have Gen Z lost faith in the monarchy? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Thangham Debonair, Observer columnist Sonia Soda and Professor of Politics at the University of Kent, Matthew Goodwin. On the programme today...
This government is unashamedly pro-business. It's as simple as that.
Can Rishi Sunak win back businesses that were told where to go by a predecessor?
What you've got is the risk here of a very small minority of very activist civil servants effectively trying to block government. That's not on, that's not democratic.
Was he the architect of his own downfall or the victim of the blob?
What she said was to be condemned. It was anti-Semitic. It's absolutely right that we acted as swiftly as we did.
Diane Abbott is suspended by Labour over anti-Semitic comments. Should she be able to sit as a Labour MP again?
I wouldn't say I don't care, but I'd say it's not necessarily something that I'm invested in. I'd say I wasn't invested in it.
The only person I know who does support the monarchy is my gran, and she loves it.
As Westminster prepares for the coronation, how are attitudes to the monarchy changing? You heard Rishi Sunak there, the Prime Minister, in the headlines as he launches something of a charm offensive with business groups. In fact, that's reflected in the Financial Times headline. Sunak launches City Charm offensive with new business forum as CBI reels. Let's focus on the charm offensive. This, of course, follows on not that long ago when Boris Johnson told businesses where to go. F business, he said. So, Laura, who is the party of business these days?
The Conservative Party is. And, you know, I'm not just saying that, but I think Rishi and Jeremy Hunt both have business backgrounds and that's well known about them. When I'm out on the doorstep, the businesses in my constituency have not forgotten his time as Chancellor and the economic package he put in place during the pandemic. That still comes up a lot. And when you think about his, you know, the 5 priorities that he hammers away at, halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists and stop the boats, 3 out of 5 are economic. And number 2, grow the economy cannot happen without businesses. And one of the things, I sort of could go through some of the measures that were announced in the spring statement, but one of the statistics I think is the most telling of all is that there's 1 million more businesses in the United Kingdom since 2010. So there's now 5.5 million businesses, 5 million of which are SMEs. That's a 20% increase in 13 years. If that doesn't tell you that the government's doing something to support business, I don't know what does.
Well, there is a battle to some extent between Labour and the Conservatives, as voters would expect, over business. But yes, the Conservatives have always seen themselves as traditionally the party of business. Who do you think the party is?
Well, I think it's the Labour Party, and I think that, in fact, I know because businesses are telling me so themselves, businesses headed up by people who are not natural Labour supporters or voters, who are saying to me they feel that the government has just given up on governing. They failed to reform the business rate system, which is causing so many of the SMEs that Laura talks about massive problems. A Labour government would be reforming the business rate system, and the Conservative government could and is not. There are other businesses who are saying to us that the whole effect of the Liz Truss disastrous budget of only a few months ago still, the effect of that is still being felt. I'm also speaking to businesses who are high energy users who feel that they're just not getting the support that they need. Now, businesses I talk to, they're not asking for government handouts to prop up every problem, but they do want a partnership, and that's not what they feel they're getting from the Tories at the moment, which is something that the Labour Party is offering to them.
Sonia, is this a strategy to win the next election? Obviously, trying to win over business, it also partly results in higher donations, quite often to political parties. Or does it actually not matter anymore?
I think it matters less than it used to 20 or 30 years ago. I think if a business leader, particularly for the Labour Party, if business leaders were saying, oh, well, we don't trust Labour in government, I think that at one point would have played into perceptions that Labour perhaps wasn't the party of economic credibility. Now, that shifted significantly in the run-up to 1997. You remember the sort of prawn cocktail initiative?
I do indeed.
And I think it, matters less these days, but I also think that, I mean, I agree with Thangham that I think the pendulum is swinging back to Labour. I think lots of business leaders sort of are working on the assumption that there is an excellent chance Labour will form the next government. I think some of them haven't been impressed at all with the Conservative government's stand on Brexit, which has made their lives a lot more difficult when it comes to exports. And I think Labour, just under Keir Starmer, doesn't have that same issue on economic credibility anymore that it did under Jeremy Corbyn.
Do you think it matters as much as it used to? Boris Johnson clearly didn't at the time he made that rather disparaging comment.
Well, it does matter, but I think the problem for business is they've had a decade, more than a decade, of constant shocks. They've had the financial crisis, Brexit, the pandemic, the Liz Truss budget, the instability around that. So what business is looking for is long-term stability, and also, Joe, answers to the long-term challenges that are facing the country. And to be honest, I don't think either Labour or the Conservatives are actually speaking to that. Productivity still very low. How are we going to wean ourselves off an economy that's dependent upon the importation of mass cheap labour? What's the Brexit economic strategy for the next 20, 30 years, not just the next 2 years? And I think business is sort of looking at these challenges and thinking nobody's really got the answers to them.
All right, let's talk about Dominic Raab, former Deputy Prime Minister. He resigned on Friday after the publication of a report into bullying claims against him. There are two contrasting views about what actually has been going on. We can take the Mail on Sunday that says there's a brutal war going on that pits ministers against the Blob. The Observer looks at it rather differently and is talking about a bullying culture across politics that must be tackled. Now, Mr Tolley, who did the investigation into 8 formal complaints, he upheld 2, finding that Dominic Raab's behaviour in those cases was intimidating, insulting and humiliating. As I said, Mr Raab resigned as a result because he said he would if any of the claims were upheld, but criticised what he believes were flawed findings that set a dangerous precedent. He talked about an activist civil servant. Which is right in your mind, Laura? Is there a bullying culture across politics or actually an activist civil service?
No, I'm not going to criticise anyone in government, either ministers or civil servants. You know, Dominic, I've worked with Dominic and I liked him and I respected him, but he said that if there was any adverse finding in Adam Tolley's report that he would resign, and he did, and I think he showed integrity in doing so, and I think that, you know, there's now a new Deputy Prime Minister.
But he's criticised the findings, despite doing what he said he would do. You're absolutely right. He has criticised the findings and said that actually it sets a dangerous precedent for ministers and government working with the civil service. Do you agree with that?
I think that, you know, I thought the report was considered, and you know, it upheld, as you said, 2 findings in respect of one department and one individual. Everything else it did not uphold. If it, you know, I think the most scorching passage in the report was reserved actually for the trial by media that he underwent in the months before, and they said there was a series of misleading reports. So, look, I think that I think it's been resolved, that matter.
Right, that's been resolved, but it does speak more widely to how that relationship is going to develop going forward. You know, is it difficult for ministers to put their project manifesto in place if they feel they have to tread too carefully, as Dominic Raab felt, with civil servants?
Well, look, just moving away from Dominic Raab, what do I think about the relationship between ministers and civil servants? I suppose I'm not in government, so I've only ever observed it as a parliamentary private secretary, and I think that, you know, it is a symbiosis that's quite unusual, and until you have a look into government, you've never seen a relationship like that, because normally people have sort of subordinates and who report up to them, and in this case, you have sort of experts who provide a really important cushion about the workings of a policy and how it's going to be implemented. And then you have the minister trying to drive what they want to do. So I suppose inevitably there will be pressure points that could emerge along the way. But I think, you know, From what I've seen very impressive civil servants and good ministers trying to shepherd them through.
You want to be the next government. Are you worried about that relationship? I mean, your colleague, Jonathan Ashworth, Shadow Work and Pension, said we will be tough. We will be tough as ministers with the civil service to make sure we can get our agenda through. What do you make of this judgment, really, in the light of that relationship?
Well, I mean, Jonathan saying we will be tough is about wanting to pursue a political agenda for which I hope we will have a public mandate after the next general election. That's not the same as using demeaning language, insulting, undermining, being aggressive. And that's what Adam Tolley's report says about Dominic Raab. I think it says something also quite profound about Rishi Sunak, that he is tolerating this sort of behaviour in his cabinet. We've had now three resignations as a result of behaviour in the course of actually quite a short premiership. Rishi Sunak did not take decisive action last week. He waited for Dominic Raab to resign. I think that shows up his weak leadership. I think that's
very
extraordinary.
respectfully, the finding that was made related to a period before Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister.
So what?
It wasn't said that,
so what?
How
He's Prime Minister now. He's Prime Minister now. And he's got Dominic Raab in his... He's had Dominic Raab in his cabinet. He could have taken action on Thursday after he'd read the report. Instead, he waited for Dominic Raab to resign. I think that shows weak leadership.
Yeah, I've just written a book about what I call the new elite in the institutions that are moving away from the rest of the country. And I go out on a limb on this. I mean, I think Raab's right, actually. I think in some of our institutions, we've got a cultural victimhood where people are so quick to take offence. And often, and the quote he used was cultural resistance. He said there is a cultural resistance within the civil service to projects that challenge the consensus like Brexit. And let me tell you one thing, Joe. Since my book came out, and I'm not going to tell you who they are, I've had 3 senior civil servants call me and say, we have a problem within the civil service at accepting and implementing projects that challenge what we might call the established consensus. And those are senior civil servants within the institution. And we do, I think it's pretty obvious, that the amount of stuff that is leaked from the civil service when it happens to involve projects that undermine the consensus, that's not a coincidence. I think Raab is raising a legitimate point, which is have we got the balance right?
Some people may not be old enough as I am to remember Yes Minister, but the whole point of that series was predicated on exactly that, the idea of civil servants resisting political pressures. Now, I think that we have to be good leaders, and being good leaders can mean being tough, but it does not mean undermining, insulting, degrading. I think the worst that my staff can say about me and do is that I can sometimes be quite grumpy in the mornings. That's not undermining, insulting, and we have to be able to lead by example and also be able to pursue a political agenda with confidence and leadership, not by doing the things that Dominic Raab is found to have done.
I also think there's a real danger in conflating a conversation about bullying, about which there was an independent investigation conducted by a very senior KC who made findings on the basis of the evidence and the interviews that he conducted, conflating that conversation with a bigger conversation about reform of the civil service and tensions, creative tensions, uncreative tensions as they may exist between a political government and an independent civil service. For me, the two questions are separate ones. Nothing excuses the behaviour that was uncovered and found to have happened in that report. No tensions between civil servants and minister means that a minister has to behave in ways that are intimidating and are, humiliating. So I think that's really, really important. I think there's a separate question about the civil service. Now, the tricky thing about this is I think absolutely you may have some senior civil servants who kind of said that to you, but I think there's also, there's two ways of looking at this. I think there's also senior ministers who will put forwards unworkable proposals to the civil service and expect them to be delivered. What am I talking about? I'm talking about Dominic Raab's proposals for things like parole reform, for reform of the British Bill of Rights. Now, the civil service job is sometimes to say, well, Minister, we take your political agenda, but it's going to be very these are reasons why it's difficult to implement. And I suspect there is a lot of sensitivity on the part of a minister like Dominic Raab seeing that as insolence rather than the civil service doing its job.
Matthew, I mean, there were also cases and instances under the Blair government when they were pushing forward things like 42 days without charge. I think there was a lot of resistance within the civil service. Is this specifically to the Conservatives or a Conservative government, or do you have this resistance existing in all parties or against all parties?
I think we've always had some cultural resistance. I think you saw that also during the Corbyn era, when lots of people was sort of voicing some criticisms of Corbyn and where the party was going.
Although that was in opposition, they weren't actually working in government.
When we look at, say, for example, Brexit, which is the most recent example, both the Treasury and other parts of the civil service, I would argue, have put out things that are, you know, pretty openly partisan or taking a political position, which you wouldn't ordinarily expect the state to do. And on the bullying point, by the way, when I read the report, let's take Gordon Brown, Liam Byrne, David Blunkett, we've always had ministers who have been very assertive at conveying their views and their policy preferences, right? But some of those things that I read in the report, you know, speaking directly during meetings, asking people to uphold a standard in their work. I mean, to be honest, Joe, I say some things like that when I'm working in a university, which is I expect people to turn up, I expect them to do a good job.
But that's not what the bullying, that's not what the findings of bullying were about.
But there are bits in that report that surely were not actually bullying.
But that's not what the findings of bullying were about. Actually, the report says that in some circumstances, the use of this language may be appropriate, but the report found specific instances where behaviour was unacceptable and unprofessional.
I mean, in terms of reform of the civil service, which has been discussed in some of the papers today, do you think that's necessary? I mean, there were calls by Francis Maude, who was a former Cabinet Office minister, to say perhaps the civil service needs to be more political because of what has been discussed, Laura, and actually perhaps Cabinet Secretaries, Cabinet Ministers should be able to appoint their own permanent secretaries. The person they work with at the top of the civil service in their department would make it easier.
I don't think I have enough experience of the civil service to give any judgment on that, but I've read really interesting sort of academic pieces about making it a leaner organisation, which is probably something that could apply in lots of different sectors. And I think the other thing is that probably the most tension that will exist between a senior minister and a civil servant is when what they're trying to do is quite radical. And that could be a Labour or a Conservative government. And, you know, I was looking at some, well, I won't go into it, but some Labour legislation that sort of didn't really work, that was from 2004. And I was sort of trying to figure out why it hadn't. And thinking that I think that would have been a good example of where there would have been direct difficulties, because in the end, the legislation itself didn't exactly operate as Labour had intended it to. And I think that, therefore, the more of a reforming minister you have, or the more of a kind of, you know, visionary minister, the more likely there is to be a difficulty with, you know, because you're moving from the status quo, you're moving... And, of course, the civil servant's job is to facilitate, but I think you could probably get tension there.
Would you agree?
And I think sometimes that tension's actually quite important. And I think sometimes you see circumstances where legislators clearly don't understand the legislation they're creating and trying to pass. For example,
I think that's true.
I watched a lot of the debate in Scotland around the gender recognition bill, and the level of understanding amongst some politicians was terrible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, actually.
You need sometimes experts to be advising ministers and saying this is why your law won't
And that was
achieve.
transposed into the House of Commons when it was debated on the floor of the House. I mean, it was almost like sort of, you know, XYZ met apples and pears, people who just did not really understand what they were debating, making really impassioned speeches, but they were completely off subject.
But if you then look at what the government is doing at the moment, so for instance, we're going to have the illegal migration bill back for more stages on Wednesday. It's still, the government has still not published an impact assessment, so we still don't know what the government's own assessment of the impact of this bill will be. They put down over 100 new amendments last week, which virtually rip up the existing bill and replace it with a new bill. This is not a good way to govern, and it's also not a good way for us to be able to scrutinise the bill. And I suspect, to come back to the civil service question, that there must have been really robust discussions, shall we say, in the Home Office about, but Minister, we do actually have an assessment of the impact, but you are intending not to publish it. I don't know if that's happened, but I rather wonder, because it is really strange not to do that. That is a strange way of governing. And I think that does mean that civil servants will have raised concerns. I think it's very unlikely that they won't. And then what? You know, the minister eventually can decide just to go ahead anyway, and that's what's happening at the moment.
I mean, there was an interesting conversation that Adam Tolley refers to with the former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Justice, talking to Dominic Raab about his behaviour, which he changed, according to her. I mean, does that mean that just the rules of engagement have changed in a modern workplace? I mean, things have changed, and maybe some ministers need to catch up. Laura?
Well, I'm not quite sure the finding was quite like that, but anyway,
well,
I think that...
I'm
yes,
paraphrasing a bit.
He did say that Dominic Raab had changed, that he thought that he could have changed earlier. And I think that if the workplace expectations of behaviour have changed, then good. Actually, workplace expectations have changed through time. Some of the practices that we would have been expected to tolerate as working people, even 10, 15 years ago, are no longer legal.
And is that a good thing?
Is it that, or is it that now in our culture of victimhood, the bar has gone so low that the moment anybody perceives themselves to have been offended in some way, that it's automatically automatically translated into a formal complaint? If you read some of the grievances in that report, they are clearly not bullying.
And 6 of them were dismissed, and 2 of them he found that there was insulting, degrading, humiliating and aggressive behaviour.
For sure,
that's not okay.
But I'm saying that we can't just look at this independent of how our culture is changing, and our culture is changing in a way in which people are incentivised to log complaints every time they feel offended in some way. That feelings are often trumping facts.
I do think it's got to be a happy
well, I think one of the things, I can't resist, just have to say this, because I used to be an employment lawyer. One of the issues is that there is no definition of bullying in employment law, and it normally manifests as a claim of constructive unfair dismissal because the person resigns because they're very upset, and then they have quite a high threshold to bring. So bullying exists in this sort of ministerial context where normally you don't have a remedy for it. And so actually, in the years, more than a decade, I did that area of the law. Nothing really changed. But there weren't really bullying claims. It either was something quite specific like sex discrimination or sexual harassment or a constructive dismissal claim, and therefore one of the reasons I think we have issues with bullying is that it isn't defined anywhere in law.
I think sorry. I think this is such an interesting subject though, and I think one of the things that's tricky about both bullying but also coercive control and domestic abuse is these are patterns of behaviour that we recognise can have profound impacts on individuals that go beyond the sum of their parts, because they're about a pattern of behaviour that's about controlling or instilling fear. And I think we've got a lot of catching up to do in our legal system, in employment law. It's very hard to recognise something that's a pattern of behaviour rather than one specific incident, whether it did or didn't happen. I think it's genuinely quite complex how you deal with that.
Let's talk about the Labour MP. No, not at all. Labour MP Diane Abbott, well, actually, she's effectively been kicked out of the parliamentary party for a letter published in The Observer. In the letter, she's talking about racism. And she says about Jews, Irish people and travellers, they undoubtedly experience prejudice. This is similar to racism. Many types of white people with points of difference, such as redheads, can experience this prejudice. But they are not all their lives subject to racism. As I said, she has had she's had the whip removed by the Labour Party. You heard Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, there in the headlines. Now, she has withdrawn her remarks and she has responded. She's apologised and says racism takes many forms, and it is completely undeniable that Jewish people have suffered its monstrous effects, as have Irish people, travellers and many others. She apologises for any anguish caused. Is there a way back for Diane Abbott into the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party?
I don't know. And that's why the whip has been suspended and there will be an inquiry, and quite right too, because when I read those remarks yesterday morning, I was angry, I was upset. I felt that this was an atrocious comparison to make, absolutely atrocious. And I think, that much has been made of an apology, but for someone to say, I distance myself from my own remarks, for me is really quite problematic, and I think that's why we do need to let the inquiry take place. It's absolutely right the whip was withdrawn, and I'm glad it was done so promptly. I am absolutely sure that the Leader's Office and the Whip's officers were inundated with messages from colleagues saying this cannot be allowed to stand. I don't know what the future holds for Diane Abbott. I do know that her past contains a pioneering woman of whom we all should be, very proud of her achievements. She should be proud of her achievements. But this is not that. And two things can be true at once. She can have had a pioneering past and at the same time have said some atrocious things. I don't really know how you distance yourself from your own remarks.
Right.
But that will hopefully come out in the inquiry.
But that does mean there is a path. There could be a path.
I don't know.
Back into the Labour. I mean, do you have anything? It's hard to see.
It is. I find it hard to see it.
I mean, on the basis that Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader, was told that he could have the whip restored if he made a very full apology for comments he made in the wake of the report into allegations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party has concluded that he didn't do enough. But should that then, on that basis, be offered to Diane Abbott?
Well, I quite rightly won't be part of the inquiry. I mean, this is now a party process, and we were rightly criticised for, in the past, politicians getting involved in complaints processes. The EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, said that we needed a good and independent process. We do now have parts of that process which, if necessary, the Labour Party can refer this investigation to the independent element. That may be necessary. I think for me to speculate about what happens next is not helpful. However, you know, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn. He was given, as a result of an inquiry, given a path of action which he could choose to follow or not. He chose not, and therefore he is where he is. Diane will presumably be offered a fair and rigorous investigation, which we should respect.
But you don't think at this point there is a way back?
Hard to see.
Hard to see. Do you think Diane Abbott will stand as a Labour MP at the next election?
I think it depends entirely on her action. So I'm somebody who believes that there's always the possibility of redemption and forgiveness following a period of reflection, of trying to make amends for harm and hurt that may have been caused. I think the issue for Diane Abbott, notwithstanding everything that Thangham said about her track record, and she has achieved some pretty amazing things, but she's also said some pretty offensive things in the past too. But I think the issue here is that she has a track record on anti-Semitism. So back in 2016, she claimed that claims of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, including by some of her colleagues who are Jewish, were smears against the Labour Party, and that preceded a report from the EHRC that found that the Labour Party acted unlawfully under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in discriminating against Jewish people. So certainly the apology that she offered very quickly, I think, was problematic for the reasons Thangham has said. It didn't go far enough. It didn't acknowledge her track record on this. There is always, though, I think, space for someone to reflect deeply and properly on mistakes they may have made, bad things they may have said, and to earn forgiveness. But that forgiveness probably is not within my gift as somebody who wasn't affected by these remarks.
We're going to move on, and very, very briefly, because we've got lots of other things to talk about.
It's an important point, because I wasn't surprised at all when I read those comments, because this is what happens when people give the identitarian left a free pass, and Diane Abbott has been given a free pass for years and years. It's not only that she's made comments regarding British Jews, which are disgusting, she's also made the case for Chairman Mao. Imagine coming on TV and making the case for Hitler. That's basically the equivalent point. And I think this is the problem, Joe. When it comes to identity politics, people like Abbott get a free pass. She shouldn't be allowed back into the Labour Party. She shouldn't be allowed back into politics. This should be the end of a political career.
All right. To just depersonalise slightly, I think it is very revealing about Keir's strategy, because although he may have silenced those voices, those views, those pernicious views about Jewish people are still prevalent on the Labour left, even if they're, generally not expressed. And I think that's really worrying in the whole effort to bring Jewish voters back to Labour, because, the damage was so unbelievably profound. And, it is a classic trope, isn't it, that anti-Semitism is not a genuine form of racism. And that was what effectively her letter said. And I think that's a really big problem for him.
And that's why he suspended her from the whip as quickly as possible.
Let's talk to Daniel Chandler, economist and philosopher at the London School of Economics, author of the book Free and Equal. Welcome to you, Daniel. You wrote this book because you say society is clearly unfair, with trust in democracy very, very low. Why? Why do you think that is?
Well, look, I think it's really easy at the moment to point to all of the problems that our societies have, some of which you've just listed. And I think what's really difficult to find right now is a coherent vision of what a better, fairer society would actually look like. I think our politics feels often quite narrow and technocratic, and particularly at the moment, like we're just being buffeted from one crisis to another without any clearer, longer-term sense of direction. And, I think it's in moments like this that we need a sort of broader a vision of what a better society would look like. And in my book, Free and Equal, what I try to do is to draw on the ideas of a philosopher called John Rawls, who's, in many ways the kind of towering figure of 20th century political philosophy. And I think his ideas really have the solutions to the problems that you listed. And what's so exciting about those ideas, and why I think anyone interested in politics and in the future of liberal democracy ought to know about them, is that they aren't just interesting, they're genuinely useful. And what we get from Rawls is a set of clear principles to do with freedom, equality and sustainability that can exactly give everyone a toolkit for thinking through the kinds of questions that you've been talking through today, and which all of us are very worried about and would like to see addressed.
And what about the solutions then? You've talked about the sort of principles as you see them, based on John Rawls to some extent. But how would you get there? What are the specifics that you would like to see implemented by a Conservative or Labour government?
Yeah, exactly. And answering those questions is really at the heart of my book, to move from philosophy towards practical solutions, and that's where I'm drawing on my training as an economist. I think the place I would start would be to reform our political system itself. And I think the biggest problem that we have with our political system, or one of the biggest, is the role that money plays in politics. You know, in the last election in 2019, just over 100 super donors were responsible for nearly half of all of the donations going to political parties, each of those people giving nearly £500,000 each. And I think, you know, that is a ridiculous way for a democracy to function. And I think there are some very good solutions to that. So if we look to Seattle, in Seattle, what they did was limit private donations to political parties to a very low level, and then replace private funding with a system known as democracy vouchers, where basically each citizen was given an equal amount. It's $100 in Seattle over each election cycle, and they're able to donate that money to the party of their choice. And I think that's an idea that puts power in individual citizens' hands and will completely transform the incentives of our democracy.
All right, well, let's get some reaction from our guests. First of all, from you, Matthew, do you recognise this sort of low levels of trust in democracy, that things have to change fundamentally in order to restore that trust from voters?
Definitely. I do think there's a curious story ever since Brexit, which is we saw levels of trust increase slightly among some of the groups that had traditionally not engaged with the political system. For lots of working class voters, for lots of non-graduates,
and has
they
that gone
actually
down again?
felt that their voice was back into the conversation. But it's true, we still have low levels of trust. I think what's interesting is when we talk about practical ideas, and you know, I think we're right to look at the role of money. I think we should probably actually, Joe, be looking at electoral reform as well, probably longer term. I think we need to be looking at citizens' assemblies. I think we need to be looking at more participatory budgeting, sending power down to the local level.
Oh, strong agreement on this side of the table.
I don't know why you're surprised. I don't know why you're surprised. I think reform more generally is the obvious response to the political rebellions of the last decade. That's what people are calling out for.
Right. Well, let's get a response from the politicians. Laura, what do you think? Do you agree?
Well, actually, I do partly agree with what you said. I do think we could improve the way we get people into politics, and certainly I think you could improve the way that Westminster works, actually. But when I read John Rawls, and I remember really he had an effect on me, like you, but I think that
a different outcome from that?
No, slightly different. I found there was a bit more nuance. So I think that one of the things I got from the sort of précis of your book, that it was about equalising outcomes as much as possible through taxation and so on. And one of the things that Rawls kind of canvasses in his work is whether or not the individual is responsible for their own talent and efforts, or whether it's something that's arbitrarily kind of, you know, bestowed upon you, and you're very lucky to find yourself very hardworking. And I suppose I've always really sort of had a strong belief in the power of the individual, and never been fully persuaded by any kind of didactic state-imposed equalisation exercise, because I think there's a lot more you can do to power the levers to give people access to better opportunities rather than trying to drive.
Well, Daniel, do you want to respond to that specifically?
Yes, please. So, I mean, you know, the Rawls has two principles for thinking about inequality and economic justice. One is exactly as you're talking about, a principle of equality of opportunity. I think that is right at the heart of Rawls's theory. But Rawls argues that equality of opportunity on its own isn't enough, and that we need to combine that with a broader vision of shared prosperity. And I think it's the combination of those two things that we need. So, you know, I think it would be wrong to characterise Rawls as someone who only cares about equality of outcome. And really at the heart of my book and of Rawls's philosophy are ideas for equipping people to take part in our economy, to contribute in return for a fair reward. And just to come back to some of the topics that Matthew touched on, also in my book I make the case for proportional representation. I think that's another very important reform to our political system, and exactly for different ways of engaging citizens much more directly in the political process through things like citizens' assemblies. And, you know, I think on top of that, if we really want to restore trust, I think addressing the concerns and interests of lower income and particularly non-college educated voters is really absolutely central. And, you know, I think investing much more in vocational education and maybe shifting the focus there away from universities is important. important. And anyway, lots of other ideas.
Well, let's come back to some of the things you mentioned. Proportional representation thing, and what about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole load of things we could do with electoral reform. I'd like to see votes at 16. Keir Starmer has announced that, and Gordon Brown's commission has announced the proposal of how we could reform the House of Lords, which I think is well overdue. But Daniel also mentions he brings up money in politics. I think one area that's really important for reform, and that obviously needs to take place in the minds of MPs as well as the rules, as we're seeing constantly at the moment, is the influence of money on MPs whilst they are in office. It is astonishing to me that we have had a series of Conservative Party leaders who have defended people who have certainly seemed to have broken the rules that we already have. So we had the Owen Paterson affair, which eventually led to him resigning from his seat, and quite right too. But the Prime Minister of the day was defending him and effectively trying to change the rules in reverse. Now, that's another aspect of money in politics which really needs looking at. I'd also start with second jobs. I mean, really, my job is more than full-time. Let's stop that.
All right, well, you want to start there. What about one of the issues that Daniel raises is higher levels of taxation to pay for some of the things that he would like to see to lead to a fair and equal society? I think I'm paraphrasing correctly, Daniel. And at the moment, well, we've definitely got those higher historically levels of taxation under a party. I'll come to you. This is only historic by UK standards.
Absolutely.
Higher levels of taxation by a party who's promised low levels of taxation. Does that not lead to a lack of trust too, Laura?
Well, Jo, am I answering you or Daniel? But I will tell you...
Daniel.
Look, I've actually got to answer Jo now. But I was just going to say, I think we've come out of a unique world event, which is the pandemic. It's known that 400 billion was spent on that, and there have to be unusual fiscal measures taken to at least get things moving. Of course, we want to reduce taxes, and I hope soon. I hope soon we'll be through the worst of the storm in order to do that. But when you talk about sort of increasing, I suppose, Daniel, the tax burden, I mean, it is already the case that those with the broadest shoulders, particularly in relation to income tax, pay, by far the most tax. And you could go on forever, of course, but you then get into this realm where you're punishing success, you're disincentivising effort and promotion. And you can also get in this global kind of economy we live in, people just leaving the United Kingdom. So finding the sort of spirit level where you're both maximising your tax take but not doing it in a way that's completely disincentivising to success, I think is difficult, a very difficult exercise. And I'm never really attracted by sort of tax the rich.
Well, Daniel, how are you going to persuade both parties? Because the Labour Party is not advocating higher taxes either.
So, look, I think that the first thing is to say that this is definitely not an agenda about punishing success. And at the heart of Rawls's philosophy is an idea of harnessing everyone's, the different talents that people have for the benefit of everyone. And I think it's the for the benefit of everyone part of that equation that we've slightly lost sight of, and which I'm trying to bring back into our agenda through my book. And, on the question of the overall level of taxes, I completely agree that, it's very important that taxes don't go so high that they cut off growth and prosperity. I think that's absolutely right. But I think that debate about what that level should be needs to be informed by the facts. And the fact is that all of the economic evidence, and I'm speaking here as an economist, suggests that we're really quite a long way away from the point at which high taxes are likely to cut off growth. And we know that both from, we can look at countries like France and Denmark that have a higher tax rate, where growth levels over the long run have been very comparable to countries like the UK. Well, I'm going to let you come back because
you said
you are advocating slightly. No, that wasn't what I said.
Right.
I just wanted to push back slightly because I think there are other aspects of the taxation system which we can reform to make it fairer. We have advocated for some time now that the tax break for the super rich, which is the non-dom tax break, if that was abolished, it would bring in £3.2 billion, which would help us with the NHS.
Not insignificant,
there are ways
but
of doing
it's not
things.
really transformative in terms of
is trying to is looking at.
But it's not transformative. You're actually saying we're still not got high enough tax compared to other countries.
I think we should be paying more tax. I think there are some countries, so for example in Scandinavia, where people pay a high proportion of GDP in tax. The reason why I think we need to do that is, so for example, we're not spending enough on healthcare as a country. Ageing countries tend to spend more on their health as they get richer because they're ageing and because of the increasing cost of medical technology. We're spending less on our healthcare than countries, equivalent countries like Germany and Austria, for example. I think we should have free universal childcare. I think we should have more
We're getting
substantial...
close to that with the announcement that was made in the budget. I mean, it's going to be from 9 months to start of school.
Although not till 2025.
It still doesn't, and I think it should be wraparound in schools as well. I think we should have much greater support with older care. I think people are finding themselves in situations where they're having to pay for older care and they just don't have the means to do it. So I think we should be paying more. I think we'd be a better society if we did. But politicians have to make the political case for it, and they have to win that argument with the electorate. Gordon Brown's penny on national insurance for the NHS
it wasn't
one of the
into
most
a campaign, was it?
No, but it raised
was.
money, and
did.
money was spent on the NHS, and it was one of the most popular tax rises ever. I think more than 90% of the public supported it at the time.
I'm just going to get final response from you, Daniel, to what you've heard briefly.
Yeah, well, I just was thinking, I was agreeing with a lot of what Sonia was saying, and I think that the key to making the political case for higher taxes is to make that case as part of a much broader vision for what a genuinely better, fairer society would look like. And I think it's that bigger vision that's been missing, and which philosophers like Rawls can help inspire us to put back into our politics.
Daniel Chandler, thank you very much for joining us. We only have a few minutes left, I should say, on the programme to talk about whether public attitudes towards the monarchy are changing. Let's just have a look at this poll. It was commissioned for a Panorama programme that is out this evening, looking at the public's view of the monarchy. Of course, the coronation is coming up. You can see there 26% of the general population supports the idea of an elected head of state, compared to 38%, obviously considerably higher, of people aged 18 to 24. And that is a lot higher than it has been, certainly the last time a similar poll like this was done. Obviously, this is just one poll, but what do you make of it? Do you think there should be an elected head of state, Matthew?
Well, on the poll, it's completely consistent with what I've been looking at for the last 18 months or so. Gen Z are the most likely generation in British history to say, let's have an elected head of state over the monarchy. They're also the least likely to feel proud of being British, to feel proud of our national history. And I think, in a sense, Joe, what we're seeing here, and we're going to have to come back in 20 years and revisit, but I think we're seeing the rise of a generation that is simply less wedded to the traditional institutions and symbols of nationhood than older generations. And I feel, actually, as though the royal family hasn't quite grasped the breadth of the challenge that it's facing, the magnitude of it. And I think it's not only generational change, Joe. We also, and this is where I suspect others will depart with me, we have the rise of an ideology in this country that is fundamentally opposed to what is Britishness, that is fundamentally opposed to the institutions that represent who we are. And I think Gen Z is at the forefront of that ideology, which is in schools, in universities and so on. And I think partly that's feeding into what we're seeing.
What do you think is driving? I was just going to show people, this is slightly historic in the sense it's a few months ago. This was your tweet, Sonia. What a deeply weird and messed up institution a constitutional monarchy is. Is it really any surprise it produces outcomes like this? Now, I know you're referring to something else in terms of the outcomes. I think it was Spare. I think it was the Prince Harry.
Yes, it's a whole fallout with Harry and Meghan.
So are you part of the 26% that would like to see an elected head of state?
Well, it's not going to be a hill I die on. So when I take a step back, I am on principle a Republican in the sense that I think it's wrong that somebody through birthright has a constitutional role in our political system. But, it's not top of my to-do list. I think the bulk of the public are very happy with the monarchy. I think the Queen was an amazing public servant. I'm sure King Charles will be too. So it's not really on the top of my to-do list. But I do think there are questions to be asked. I think the way it's set up, the outcomes it produces of some very unhappy people, this is what I was referring to, this idea that you have an heir and a spare is quite unkind to the people who are in the monarchy. And that's what I think I was getting at through that tweet.
Are you going to put the bunting out on Coronation Day?
Well, the television will be on. It's also my mum's birthday weekend, so we're very grateful for the extra bank holiday, so thank you for that. But I think, I was really fortunate enough to be at a garden party at Buckingham Palace last year. The Queen wasn't quite well enough to be there too. But what really struck me was how the modern-day monarchy is doing things like inviting people to come along to occasions like that, as the King is for his coronation, who have served our country, and kind of turning out the idea that it should be the politicians and the great and the good, but actually taking a modern approach to that and saying, who is it who has served our country? Let's invite them, let's make them feel part of it. And I think that will be a moment for national celebration.
What do you think is driving attitudes if they're changing in the way the poll suggests?
I was just thinking, though, Joe, Do you not think it's the case that as you age, you naturally become closer to institutions and you have greater
respect?
Well,
it's the old adage, isn't it?
For the kind of for pride of place.
And ever thus, yes.
You know, one of the things, I mean, actually, I think when the Queen died, it was such a national shock. It was very unclear how the King and his Queen would be received. And they're so sort of natural and more comfortable in the roles than I perhaps expected them to be. And it's also so nice seeing the Queen, because she took so much unfair flack and criticism at one point in her life.
I'm going to tell, just before we do that, because you can see the whole report on Panorama tonight. It's on at 8 o'clock on BBC One and the iPlayer, and full details of the poll are on the BBC News website. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Sorry about that, Matthew. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer. You'll just all have to come back on again.
Ready?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I am.
Well, then we best get started.
You two are by far the worst performing teachers in this school.
They have no idea what's about to hit them.
They won't stop, and we won't stop, and it's a race.
Come on! The best spring on TV. Press red to watch now on BBC iPlayer.
Eurovision is coming to the UK. Are you ready?
The Eurovision Song Contest starts the 9th of May, live across the BBC.
Afternoon from BBC Two. Matthew watching with you live. The Crucible Theatre Sheffield delivering on drama big time. The second round World Snooker not done yet.
Looks to be enjoying every minute out there.
To play like this and win the last two frames, I'm so pleased with myself. Normally I'm quite relaxed after I win a game or lose a game, but this time I'm very happy.
And Ronnie O'Sullivan finishes this match off with back-to-back centuries.
Each match is just a pleasure to be involved in at the Crucible, you know, win or lose, you know, you just want to be out there playing.
Mark Allen, for the first time for 5 years, gets himself into the quarter-final.
I'm just happy to still be here in the quarters. I feel like I'm one of the form players of the season and I'm one of the form players of the tournament, so just need to keep that going.
Jack Jones beats Neil Robertson. Impressive.
He's a legend of the game. To beat him in the last 16, I'm pleased with that.
This break has been, well, just sublime.
Kyron Wilson congratulates John Higgins on an absolute wonderful performance.
Not used to winning big events nowadays. Try and win this for a fifth time, it'd be incredible.
We've all had a Monday morning off and now we're raring to get back into what has been a fascinating tournament here at the World Snooker Championship so far. 5 players have made it through to this year's quarterfinals. There are 3 more places up for grabs. And by the close of play tonight, we will be down to our final 8. And so far, this is how the draw is shaping up. Ronnie O'Sullivan will face Belgium's Luca Brissell, who of course knocked out Ronnie's friend from the class of '92. That was Mark Williams. And that second portion of the draw featuring McGill, Lesowski, Milkins and Jawi. Well, it's really opened up a big opportunity for those players, hasn't it? With Trump and Murphy both out. Allen, the player of the season, he will face Jack Jones, Neil Robertson's conqueror. And then, as you can see right at the bottom there, Higgins, who is in imperious form, beating Kyron Wilson over 2 sessions, will play the winner of Mark Selby and Gary Wilson. Well, it's a pleasure to have your company on this Monday afternoon, and I'm delighted to have Shaun Murphy and Steve Davis here with me in the Winter Garden. So, gents, we've just seen the draw. It's shaping up rather nicely. We've seen some big hitters make it through, and some new faces as well, Shaun.
Yeah, it's great to see, isn't it? I mean, you know, from all the young players who've come through, some debutants this year, and they've done really well. But there are still some big hitters left in there, and they'll be wanting to be here come the end of the week for sure.
Talking of big hitters, John Higgins was in incredible form. We have to talk about him. He got the job done over 2 sessions against Kyren Wilson, and he said before the match that he felt like he was playing his best, and that's exactly what we saw.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing feeling it, it's another thing doing it out there, but he really has, I think, shocked everybody here, because we thought that Kyren Wilson was a player with more momentum, especially after making that 147 break. I don't think he was a massive favourite, but I'm sure the bookmakers made him one, and he's just had the carpet just whipped away from under him by a fantastic performance by John Higgins. You know, he's had a great record here in recent years, but without winning it. Who knows? He still could win the event.
It's interesting, last night after his match he mentioned that he'd been fiddling with things in his technique. He actually admitted to shortening his cue by a good 1.5 inches. You know, we all play with standard length cues. Well, he's, you know, a bit shorter than some of the players. He's taken the length of his cue. He feels much more compact. And, I mean, look at the results. It's been unbelievable.
It was unbelievable to watch. Now, Higgins making it through means that he's set himself up with a potential tie against Mark Selby, should Selby beat Wilson later on this evening. That's a tie worthy of any final.
It is, you know, and if you know, Mark Selby converts his 10-6 overnight lead, then all of a sudden that is set up for another match. I don't think anybody's got a clue how it's going to go. The two lumps of granite rubbing up against each other is tough.
That's a lovely way of describing it. What about Jack Lisowski? Now, I think we watched the opening session of him and Anthony McGill together. He did not really turn up, did he, in that? But then we saw a lot better of him in the second session. So how does the third session play out? Well,
it's one of those things, a bit like a golfer who shoots 7 or 6 under in the first round. They have that advantage of being able to just carry that through the rest of the event. McGill opened up such a huge advantage. Lisowski did very, very well to get back into the game somewhat through the second session. But obviously McGill in the ascendancy, he can just match Lisowski now to the line, and you'd expect McGill to run out the winner.
OK, well, that's what we have to look forward to this evening. Let's actually show you what you can look forward to over the course of today. We've got some cracking matches for you this afternoon. Of course, we've just got the one. It's Si Jiahui against Robert Milkins. Si Jiahui just the 2 frames away from a place in this year's quarterfinals. Of course, all eyes on that table because Higgins got the job done early in 2 sessions against Kyren Wilson. There's confirmation of Jack Lisowski against Anthony McGill. That's at 7 o'clock on table 1 later on this evening. And at the same time, you can watch Mark Selby against Gary Wilson. Selby with that 4-frame advantage. But look, let's focus on the match that we have our eyes on today, Milkins against Si Jiahui. And if you missed the second session between the two, here is how it all played out.
Here we go then with the second instalment of Robert Milkins in Si Jiahui. And he will feel much better about this match at 6-3. Oh, and Rob Milkins cannot believe that he's left that red over the pocket. Si Jiahui has re-established his 4-frame cushion and settled in to this second session. Oh dear, oh dear. This is getting difficult again for Rob Milkins. He's 5 behind for the first time in the match.
Chance at long red here. Very, very good, that kind of shot.
This session is turning into a bit of a nightmare for Rob Milkins.
Best chance Rob's had in a while.
A frame he desperately needed, and he got it. He's beginning to look more like his old self.
We'll see Jiahui regret that decision.
And Rob Milkins is keeping his fighting chances alive here. From 10-3, he's now 10-5.
Safely in.
Si Jiahui takes a 6-frame cushion into what will be the biggest session of snooker of his life.
Oh, what a debut for Si Jiahui, that man there you can see in your shot. He has had an incredible tournament, hasn't he, as you well know, because you faced him in the opening round. He could have got the job done across those 2 sessions.
Yeah, he could have done, and it did look for a minute as if we might have had very little to show today, but it wasn't to be in the end. An interesting fact about this scoreline, though, is that only in the history of the Crucible Theatre has it happened twice where a best-of-25 match has been overhauled from an 11-5 deficit. I did it against Matthew Stevens in 2007, and Neil Robertson overhauled Martin Gould from the same scoreline in 2010, Neil going on to win that year. So it has happened, not very often, and you have to play almost perfect snooker to do it.
Well, that said, look, he's 2 frames away from making it through to the quarterfinals, but we've got to remind everyone that it's just the one table out there, and you know very well, all eyes on that one table. Could that impact either player?
It can if all of a sudden, the crowd get behind the underdog and all of a sudden the underdog starts to fire and come back a bit. You can feel the heat out there, especially in the one-table setup. Robert Wilkins in his last round did really well to come back from a massive deficit, so he knows it's in the bag to turn things around. But, Sergio, we're so close to the finishing line. He's only got to sort of, remain in parity for 2-all at the interval. It's all over.
Well, can he get the job done? Well, the players are ready, as you can see, so it's time to hand you over to your MC, Rob Walker. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. A week today in this magnificent arena, the Cazoo World Snooker Champion will be crowned. By the end of tonight, we'll have completed the lineup for the quarterfinals. Neither player backstage has ever made it that far before, so what an opportunity for both of them. Will the first-timer continue to flourish, or will the comeback king deliver again on day 10 of Snooker's Big One? Please welcome a hugely talented 20-year-old 2 frames away, 2 frames from becoming only the 5th player from China to make it to the quarterfinals. He's been brilliant so far in Sheffield. What a dazzling debut for Si Jiahui! And his opponent, coming to the end of his finest season on tour. Semis of the German Masters, Welsh Open champion, and seeded here for the first time. He's already mounted 1 monumental comeback in the first round. Can he do so again? He's a cider drinker, but we call him the Milkman, Robert Milkins.